Well, it's time now for business, and then I'm joined in the studio by Stephen Carroll. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Haxie.
Now, we're starting in France with those latest COVID-19 restrictions announced by President Macron on Wednesday night. The 9 p.m. curfew is going to be, of course, bad news for businesses, like restaurants in particular. Are they going to be getting more help now from the government?
Yes, says Emmanuel Macron. In that interview on French television, the president said that the government would announce new help for those businesses affected by the curfew. He particularly mentioned measures to help stop small and medium businesses from going bust because of these extra health restrictions that have been put in place. This will be on top of what's already been announced for the worst hit sectors by the COVID-19 crisis, sectors like tourism and hospitality. They can avail of the government's furlough scheme, which pays up to 84% of net salaries for workers, covers 100% of the costs for employers of not their staff not being able to work. On top of that, companies can apply for grants from the government's Solidarity Fund, depending on how much of their earnings has been lost. So if it's over 80% loss of earnings, they can get grants of up to €10,000 a month to cover costs. If the loss of more than 50% of earnings, it can be up to €1,500 a month to cover those losses. There are also state-backed loans available to these firms too.
And what's the situation for individuals here?
So the president acknowledged in the interview that it was particularly young workers and those on precarious contracts who'd lost work and earnings as a result of this crisis. And to try and help those most in need, he announced an additional payment for those who were on the basic social welfare payment here in France. It's called RSA, and it's for people who are not eligible for other forms of benefits. So it really is those who are on the least amount of money from the welfare system. They're going to get €150 extra to cover this up to 6-week period, perhaps longer. We still don't know, of course, how long these curfews are going to last, with €100 for each dependent child as well. This, as we've been hearing from campaign groups in recent weeks, that there are up to 1 million more people in France in poverty in 2020.
Now, we're turning next to South Korea, Stephen, and the stock market launch of the record label backed by K-pop stars BTS.
Shares in Big Hit Entertainment have more than doubled on their first day's trading in South Korea. Demand for these shares was huge, driven by the K-pop band's fan base. BTS are Big Hit's biggest earner. They accounted for 97% of the company's revenues last year. This stock market debut makes the company's CEO a billionaire and each of the band members multi-millionaires. The company is now one of the 40 most valuable in South Korea. Investors seemingly unconcerned about the looming military service for the band members.
세계 최고 수준의 음악과 아티스트를 기획할 수 있는 제작 역량을 갖췄을 뿐 아니라 전 세계에서 팬덤 비즈니스를 가장 잘 이해하는 기업으로서 이를 사업 부가가치로 가장 잘 전환시킬 수 있는 역량을 보유하고 있습니다.
So a very good day on the first day on the markets for Big Hit in South Korea, and they're actually going against the trend that we've seen on the stock markets today. The Kospi and Seoul actually trading down almost 1%. More generally, investors in Asia pessimistic about the prospects of a stimulus plan being agreed in the United States, and we know that those sort of plans tend to have a big impact on the markets around the world. That is the picture on the Asian markets a short time ago.
And finally, from you, executives at Starbucks are going to have their bonuses linked to increasing diversity at the company.
I'm just going to go back first to a story from the International Monetary Fund to do with austerity in this crisis. Many advanced economies, according to the IMF, can now borrow freely and they don't need to plan for future cuts to pay for pandemic support. That's according to the fund's fiscal policy chief. It contrasts with the advice from the IMF during the last financial crisis, when it was advocating in many cases austerity to pay for the cost of the crisis. Government debt likely to hit a record high this year, but the IMF says cheaper borrowing costs mean that states that can afford to should boost public spending. Meanwhile, the group of the 20 most industrialised nations has agreed to extend debt relief for emerging economies for an additional 6 months. That's until June of next year. Debt campaigners say the deal falls short of what's needed. Fraser Jackson reports.
Another 6 months respite for the world's poorest countries. G20 finance ministers have agreed to prolong a freeze on debt repayments for up to 73 nations, allowing them to focus their funds on the coronavirus pandemic.
The pandemic has aggravated debt vulnerabilities and threatened the fiscal sustainability of many countries, particularly the poorest countries.
Under the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or DSSI, repayments can be deferred but not reduced. Campaigners have said the step doesn't go far enough, calling for debts to be forgiven altogether. The president of the World Bank was more measured.
So it's important for the people in the poorest countries to see an actual reduction in the amount of debt, a ray of hope for the future. There are more steps that are needed in order to achieve meaningful debt relief for the poorest.
According to the Jubilee Debt Campaign, over 50 countries are already in a debt crisis, shown here in red, and the pandemic has further compounded things. In 2019, the total debt load of the world's 73 poorest countries hit a record-breaking $744 billion. And an additional $100 billion has been borrowed just since April. African countries make up the majority of the participants within the G20's DSSI debt repayment program. Some have received money from the G20's largest single creditor, China, but up until now, Beijing has been unwilling to write off debts owed. Further discussions on the program are set to be held before the G20 summit in November.
And Stephen, now we can talk about Starbucks. Executives at the company are going to have their bonuses linked to increasing diversity at the company.
I just had to keep you in suspense for a little bit longer in this story. The coffee chain is setting targets in the United States for 30% of its corporate staff and 40% of its retail employees to be people of colour. That's by 2025. It would boost representation in 9 of the 14 job levels concerned at Starbucks. Management, too, will have mandatory anti-bias training, and their pay will be linked to meeting those targets for representation. This, as the Trump administration has been discouraging companies that have federal contracts like Starbucks from issuing diversity-related targets.
He won't be very happy to hear about that. Stephen Carroll with the Business News, thank you very much. Well, that's all we have time for right now. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. There's more news coming up in just a few minutes' time.